Hello, this is Kim McAllister, and we're going to talk today about cultural competence. So our objectives on this presentation are to explain the need for culturally competent care, discuss the meaning and application of cultural competence in nursing care, discuss health disparities and how they relate to cultural consciousness, describe the Sunrise model and how it's used to operationalize Leininger's theory of cultural care. So before we get started talking about cultural competence and thinking about how to apply that with our patients and in all the different settings which we all practice, take a moment and do some self-reflection first. Have you ever been the subject of stereotyping? If so, how did that make you feel? What are 10 words that relate to your culture? What is cultural competence, and why is it important for nurses? I urge you to take some time to go through this, reflect on this, and really do this. This will help you get started on the journey of becoming a culturally competent nurse, if you're not already. So cultural competence is the use of appropriate methods for, interacting in an effective way, in a way that's sensitive and that honors and recognizes the different life ways and meanings and significance of different events and concepts in the life of our patients. Our patients come from a vast array of different backgrounds, ethnicities, and races, and they have different ages. They may have different lifestyle preferences. Some patients may have other types of practices in their life and in their health care, in the way that they access health care, in the way that they use health care, that may be very different from what you may do or other people, other healthcare professionals who are working with you as well. It's very important to identify those and recognize those because they can have a significant impact on the way that the patient is cared for and on the outcome of their illness. So cultural competence implies an awareness and sensitivity to and knowledge of the meaning of culture and its role in shaping human behavior. And that's from Anderson and McFarland in 2004. So if you're going to be culturally competent, which we as nurses are charged to be, that means that we are not only just aware and that we're sensitive, but we also understand and have knowledge of different cultures. Does that mean we have to be an expert in every single culture and lifeway and ethnicity? No, but it means that we need to recognize that those differences exist, have a working knowledge of the primary cultures and ethnicities of the people in your care, and then have access to information about other cultures. And as we move through the presentation, I have some links for you to offer some resources. I'm also going to post the plain PowerPoint online also so that you can access that and take notes. Hopefully you'll know that before now. So in order to celebrate diversity, according to this quote from Anderson and McFarland, you've also got to know your own culture and your own ethnic background and know how that influences you and what you do. Part of that is to help celebrate other cultures. It's also so that you know what kind of impact and influence that has on you and on how you view others and view the world. So why is it important to do this? We do have health disparities in this country related to inadequate access to care. When we talked about epidemiology, I spoke about the specific healthcare disparity among African American women in regards to prenatal care and infant mortality rate, and how that impacts all of healthcare for all African Americans. We need to understand that America is changing in terms of ethnicity and race, and that races that have been viewed as minority races are quickly becoming and moving into the majority. So we all need to be aware of the different needs and the different impacts that healthcare has on people of different races and ethnicities, and also look at some specific considerations according to race and ethnicity. It's very important to understand what your patient's concept of health and illness is. Health and illness has a big impact on what people see as what is ill, what is their goal. We may have some self-imposed views about goals and health that we just make assumptions that our patients are trying to achieve the same thing. But we need to be aware of what those are, because they may have very different goals and different expectations than you do. And it's important that you understand that, so that we're all on the same page and we're all working to help the patient achieve their goals. It also may be that because of their specific cultural beliefs or ethnicities, that they may want to either carry out healthcare practices that you don't agree with or that you don't think are beneficial, or vice versa. They may think some of the practices that are our normal standard of care are something that is not important or not needed. And sometimes the way we carry out our care can seriously interfere with important healthcare meaning and ritual, and may interfere with the way some of these things are carried out for patients. So it's very important to understand that. And also, differences in culture can result in a different perspective on decision making because of what I just discussed, with outcomes and expectations in healthcare being different. And also, although we may see the patient as the person who has the authority and the right to make decisions for their care, their culture or their ethnicity may specify that somebody else in their family or in their group of people or in their acquaintances, someone else may be the person who makes that decision. So there are different reasons why we need to become culturally competent. One is to give the best level of care to our patients, which is always our goal. There are certain legislative and regulatory requirements that require that we provide culturally competent care, and so we certainly want to be participating in that and doing things according to our regulations and guidelines. We also want to provide the best possible service and care to our clients and our patients. And so this is why we do this. And we also want to improve our own competency of care. We need to understand that differences in race and ethnicity can impact the course of a disease and susceptibilities. African Americans are disproportionately impacted by hypertension and also by end-stage renal disease. Part of this has to do with the fact that the way we treated hypertension for many years, the first line treatment is diuretics, and then that's followed by beta blockers. It took a while to understand that African Americans do not respond well to beta blockers. They're not very effective. And so the American Heart Society and I'm not sure of the physician group that finally made this protocol change. But now African Americans are treated with potent vasodilators and or calcium channel blockers, and those are much more effective at reducing high blood pressure. Another example is type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is more common in many racial and ethnic groups. Native Americans have a very high predisposition to type 2 diabetes. Pacific Islanders do as well. African Americans have a greater rate of type 2 diabetes, and they also have the issues with heart disease and high blood pressure. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but diabetes increases your risk of heart disease significantly, and it also increases your risk of death as well. And so it's very important for our African American patients to have their blood pressure under control and also to have their blood glucose checked on an annual basis. Latinos also have a very high rate of type 2 diabetes, as well as Asian Americans. And this goes to what I was just speaking about African Americans suffering the highest rates of end-stage renal disease and hypertension medication. I got a little ahead of myself there. So the National Institutes of Health defines health disparities as the difference in the incidence, prevalence, mortality, and burden of disease and other adverse health conditions that exist among specific population groups in the United States. And so these differences include dimension of race, location, country of origin, age, language, sexual orientation, social class, gender, religion, mental or physical abilities, and heritage. So there are a vast array of ways that health disparities can impact people and impact access to care. So it's important to be aware of those and to be sensitive for those. So we've talked a lot about culture, but we haven't defined what it is. It's a learned system of shared values, beliefs, and meaning that guide a population about their lifestyle activities. They provide a sense of direction. Ethnicity is a group identification based on a cultural tradition that is passed on from one generation to another. And that's what gives us membership into a social group and a sense of belonging. So culture is more than just values and beliefs. It also sheds light on life ways. It influences how we go about our life and how we carry out different activities that we do. And it's kind of the underlying fabric of who we are. So some of the risks that can happen to patients when we are not culturally competent, we can have misdiagnoses, and that can be because patients are not comfortable sharing their issues or their problems because we may have done something that's offensive or threatening. We may not have provided the right opportunity or setting so that they feel comfortable in sharing information. We have a tendency to go and meet people and make eye contact and want to shake people's hands, but eye contact can be very insulting to some different groups, and also shaking hands or touching people. Touching people of the opposite sex can be a problem for certain cultural groups. We can have misinterpretation of the same events. There are also barriers to use of healthcare resources. Some patients are not comfortable going into our hospitals, or they don't feel like they're able to share what their specific needs are because they may have been told that whatever arrangement they needed couldn't happen. There may be something about the facility that's a problem. A friend of mine shared that her hospital, this was a hospital in South Texas, they had a complete redecoration of the OB unit and the patient rooms. And she noticed that when the patients were admitted after the redecoration, she had a large request for towels. And she started doing some investigation and found that the family members were covering some of the pictures that were on the wall with a towel. And so they started to have a drop-off in the number of people who were delivering at that hospital. And they finally figured out that in the new redesign for the hospital unit, they had included a lot of pictures of owls. And the cultural group in that area felt that owls were a sign of bad luck or could be a bad omen. And certainly no one wants to bring a child into a room that may have negative connotations and feelings. So it was good that they finally found that out and then were able to correct it. Another problem that the same friend had at her hospital was as they were beginning to have more and more same-sex couples who were having children or were being present at the birth because they were adopting. There were a variety of different issues that were coming up. And because of the hospital policy, the other partner was not allowed to participate as fully as they would have as a spouse. And understand this is back in the days before same-sex marriage became legal and before we had some of the new legislation that we have giving family rights and so forth with this particular population. And so it's very important to understand and know that there may always be new situations and new challenges in cultural competency, but this is why it's important to be sensitive to these things and always to be getting feedback and listening to what your patients are saying or what they're not saying. We also have problems with lack of cultural competence when we don't provide the community resources and programs that are needed. So it's always important to be evaluating and reevaluating programs that you develop and continuing to have focus groups and reach out in the community and find out what things are working and what things are not. And when they're not working, could this be a cultural issue? Is this something that needs further exploration? And some of the risk associated with having a lack of cultural competence, again, ties in with disparity. Our greatest asset in this country is that we have such a wide and diverse population. It's also one of our greatest challenges because we have to eliminate the disparities. We have to identify them all, work on them, and eliminate them. I don't know when this will happen, but as nurses, we have to continually be working towards that end. As community and public health nurses, this is our job to explore these issues, find out where the deficits are, and develop ways to reach out and meet the needs of all of our clients. So the American Nurses Association does have a mandate for cultural diversity in nursing practice, and we have to understand that ethnocentric practices are no longer appropriate. We can't carry on a practice simply because this particular ethnicity or group has shown to want this particular thing. People belong now to a wider and wider range of ethnicity and people groups. And just because someone belongs to a particular ethnicity or race or other type of category that doesn't mean that they always ascribe to every part of that particular culture. So it's important to ask patients what their particular practices are so that we don't make assumptions about what they want. So there is a process on becoming culturally competent. Madeline Leininger and also Ms. Kempfina Bote have made very similar in some ways and kind of some unique cultural competent theories that are really fascinating to study. I was lucky that I was able to take just a class on cultural competency in my master's program, which I found very fascinating. And these two particular theorists are my favorite. We're going to focus on Madeline Leininger because she's in your book and because she's really the preeminent theorist. Back in the 1950s, there really was not any type of nursing theory, and there certainly wasn't any cultural competence at all. The focus of nursing at that time was focused on becoming and dealing with post-World War II issues, and nursing was very focused on being the assistant and the helper to the physician. And nursing still was not exploring itself and developing itself as a profession, as a science. And so this was really a perfect time for this to begin. Understanding that cultural competency is a 5-step process. And both Kempfina Bote and Leininger describe this as a 5-step process, and they're fairly similar in their approaches. The first step is awareness. And so if you participated at the beginning of our presentation, where we talked about doing a self-reflection, then you've begun the process of awareness, which is really great. The next step is knowledge. Having some knowledge about different cultures, having knowledge about how to be culturally competent, some knowledge about the major pitfalls in cultural competency so that you don't offend someone. Now understand it's impossible to not offend somebody all the time. And there are people with varying degrees of sensitivity that you will encounter. However, most people really appreciate when you are making an effort to understand them better and know them better. Then you're going to use your awareness and your knowledge to develop skill. Skill in conducting a cultural assessment, skill in providing competent care. And this happens when you seek out encounters. So you need to make a concerted effort to seek out cross-cultural encounters, encountering patients and populations with different ethnicities and cultures from your own. Sometimes you'll find multiple cultures within a family unit or within friends or other significant people in patients' lives, and that can call for some very careful navigating. And then you have to have cultural desire, the desire to fully become as competent as you can and to celebrate and understand other cultures. So this is a process. This isn't something that happens overnight. You begin with your self-awareness and then begin with understanding and learning more about different cultures. So the specifics, forgot to turn off my email. Let me do that real quick. So the process of awareness, as I said, begins with the self-examination and reflection, like we did with the other assessment at the beginning. You need to know what your own biases and prejudices are. Sometimes these can be sort of subconscious. You may not be fully aware. This is why it's important to reflect and think about these things and try to bring them forward. And then you need to look at, how do these biases and prejudices that I have impact the way that I deliver care? So the self-awareness, the cultural awareness assessment is an initial assessment that you do, but also an ongoing assessment. You can also think about other issues of taking care of someone who is similar in some way to someone who is hurtful to you. How would that affect the way that you take care of someone? Or how does taking care of someone who reminds you of someone that you love and care about, how does that impact the way that you care and take care of someone? Do you ever encounter someone who just makes you feel uncomfortable? Think about the things about that person that made you feel uncomfortable. Was it in part due to a lack of knowledge on your part about what was going on with that person, or was it more? Was it something about the way that person carried out or felt about their health care that influenced it to a level that made you uncomfortable? Cultural knowledge is understanding health-related cultural beliefs, looking at life processes. What is the meaning of health and illness for your patient? In your self-awareness reflection, did you identify what health and illness meant to you? Knowing what you mean it to be can help you avoid imposing that on other people. And take the opportunity to find out what getting better is, or what would feeling better mean? What would being healthy mean to that person? And so on. And think about how your own beliefs interact with that. So the cultural skill is the ability to assess relevant cultural data about problems or issues in your population and with individual patients. Also collecting data in a culturally sensitive manner. It may be that certain cultures see the information that you're requesting as offensive. In general, the African American population does not react well to intensely personal questions among strangers. You need to take time to develop some trust. Other cultures may have some similar issues about that. Asian Americans are generally extremely polite, and they may tell you what they think you want to hear. Also, Latino culture also has a tendency to be very polite and want to avoid saying something that might appear to disagree with you. And so you need to give patients the opportunity and populations the opportunity to express their own thoughts and their own desires for health care without imposing it on other people. A cultural encounter is it's different from immersion. Like an immersion is where you just go to a new culture and live and act among the people in that culture and study their life ways and participate in their culture, which is a fantastic way to get to know a culture. But rather than do that, if you don't have the time or the ability to do that, you can have a cultural encounter. And this is meeting with different cultural groups in order to understand your own understanding and your beliefs about that culture. As I mentioned, a few general concepts of a couple of cultures. Understand that the generalities are not always true with each person, because just as each person does not subscribe to the traditional cultural beliefs of that culture, they may also have some additional beliefs that you're not aware of unless you ask. You also need to conduct the encounter in a linguistically appropriate manner. So if you encounter a patient or a group of patients or a population that speaks a different language for you, what would you do? Do you know how to correctly function with an interpreter? How do you select an interpreter? You need to select an interpreter that not only speaks that client or patient's language, but also speaks the particular dialect. There can be vast differences in different regions of other countries in the dialects that are spoken and the way that information is communicated. When you're using an interpreter, you want to avoid using family members, and you want to avoid using children, because children may not understand what you're saying. Using family members may be a convenient way to get information if they also speak your language as well. But think about how you would feel having a family member know all about your illness or your problem. So healthcare institutions are responsible for having an interpreter. When you use an interpreter, you want to, first of all, determine that they speak the same specific language and dialect as the patient. You want to look at the patient when you are speaking, and then the interpreter will speak. So you need to speak clearly. You need to speak a short amount of words so that the interpreter can listen to what you're saying, interpret it, and then speak to the patient. And then the interpreter needs to have a moment to get a response back from the person if they are giving a response before you're moving on. I would also say pay attention to how long you're speaking to the interpreter, and then how long the patient is speaking back to the interpreter, and how long the interpreter speaks back to you. When I was working with Medicaid a few years ago, I had a patient with an interpreter, and I made a statement. The interpreter spoke that statement to the patient, and then the patient spoke probably about 500 words, and the interpreter turned around and said, "Oh, okay." She says, "That's all right." And I'm like, what did this person say to you? I don't think it took that many words to say, "It's okay, all right." And so then they were able to share what the person said. So you also have to deal with and take into account the peculiarities or the sensitivities of the interpreter as well. The interpreter thought that I might be offended, but I wasn't. So the process of cultural competence also involves desire, a cultural desire. You have to have the desire to be culturally competent. Nobody can impose that upon you. Yes, you need to be culturally competent to meet the different regulations and requirements, but I hope that this is something that you would want to do so that you can give your patient the best possible experience. Does that mean you're going to get out there and be the perfect culturally competent nurse tomorrow? Of course not. This is going to take time and work and effort, but you can do this. It takes time. So in order to have a culturally competent practice, you need to understand how cultural groups understand their life processes and what do they mean to them. How do they define health and illness? What is their goal in this illness? What kind of outcome do they hope to have? Do they understand how those decisions can impact their health? What cultural groups do to maintain wellnesses? Different cultural groups have different practices. Native Americans may choose to use our current medical system, but they also have shamans and other people involved in their care, and in their practices. And we need to understand what those practices are and how those impact our traditional practice. What cultural groups believe to be the cause of illness? They may have different perspectives on what caused the illness. If you look at Chinese medicine, there are a vast number of humors and other factors that play into wellness for the patient. And so they may tell you, I need to have a specific healer come in and do a particular, I wouldn't say service, but there's a practice that some people of Chinese origin like to do before they have surgery or some traumatic event. It helps to secure their soul and puts their body and mind in the best position to receive the curative treatment. And without it, then they believe that they won't recover and that the procedure won't work. So it's very important to understand that and make all of that available. And then you have to look at your own background and see how that influenced the way that you delivered care. And that's a tough one because a lot of this is subconscious and it comes out from us without us even thinking about doing it. So it takes continued vigilance to keep that from being a problem. So all of these questions are different things that you can ask in a cultural assessment. And if you don't feel like these questions are giving you the information that you need, you can certainly add other ones. These questions may lead to other questions. In other words, when talking about their religion, its importance in daily life and current practices, there may be something that they respond to that requires you to elicit more information. So understand this particular slide is not exhaustive or all-inclusive. This is kind of a tool to get you started. I've already spoken a little bit about Leininger, and in your book on page 287, you'll see the sunrise model. And this is not a theory, it's a model that will help you operationalize the theory. And you can see at the very center, towards the very bottom, is the optimal state of well-being. And the sunrise model shows all of the different factors that influence that state of well-being. And in looking at that model, that will help you to develop questions and elicit responses to information that may take you somewhere on that continuum. So I hope you'll find that helpful. Also, there is a transcultural nursing society founded by Madeline Leininger, and you can find out their position statement, standards of practice, all kinds of information that will help you in your journey to become culturally competent. There are publications, there's information about Dr. Leininger and other announcements. They have meetings every year. You can become a culturally certified nurse. So this could be another certification to add to your credentials that you may have. These are some links to some different culture quizzes. These may help you kind of see where you are. Some of them are fun, some of them are kind of interesting. One of the places for the resources, in addition to the site we were just on, is Management Sciences for Health. They have a lot of really great resources for culture and for cultural care. Let's see, trying to remember. So there's a whole list of resources that you can look at and publications. That will help you. They have different countries that they work on. And when you click on the different areas, they'll give you some information about the country and where they are. Trying to find the spot I was on a little while ago that had, can't find it. Maybe it was under tools. Oh yeah, here we go. They have tools for planning and developing human resources for HIV and other health, managing and developing assets. Some of this is business related and management related, but some of this is, if you keep going through it, it has some specific resources and information about cultures in specific areas that they are looking on that I thought might help. So in reviewing this presentation, think about what cultural competence is and the reasons why we need it, and then the different ways to carry that out. I hope that you will explore more about this. I encourage you to read the chapter carefully and understand kind of some strategies for how to carry this out in addition to what we discussed about. I hope that you found this informative. Thank you for listening.